The champagne flute slipped from my trembling fingers, crystal shattering against the marble floor of the Millbrook Country Club as my husband Bob raised his glass toward the crowded anniversary party. 40 years of marriage, 200 guests, and the man I'd loved since college was about to make a toast that would change everything. "To my beautiful wife Maggie," he began, his voice carrying across the elegant ballroom we'd rented for this milestone celebration. 40 years together, and I have to say. He paused, his eyes finding mine across the sea of our family and friends. This might just be the beginning of the most exciting chapter of our lives. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The guests murmured appreciatively, raising their glasses. In unison. My sister Carol squeezed my hand under the linen tablecloth, her grip tight with concern. Our children Jennifer and David beamed with pride from their seats at the head table, completely unaware of what was coming next. But I knew. God help me. I knew exactly what Bob was about to announce, and I was ready for it. Which is why, Bob continued, his confidence radiating through the room like a man who believed he held every advantage. I've decided to take early retirement. Effective Monday, I'll be stepping down from Thompson & Harrison Insurance to pursue new adventures. The applause was thunderous. Mike Harrison, Bob's business partner of 15 years, stood and clapped enthusiastically. Well deserved, my friend. Well deserved. What the guests didn't know was that Bob's new adventures included a condo in Fort Lauderdale, a speedboat named after his secretary Diane Collins, and divorce papers already drafted and waiting in his office safe. What Bob didn't know was that I had copies of all of it, along with 18 months of evidence that would make this anniversary truly unforgettable. I stood slowly, my emerald green dress the one Bob had complimented that morning when he thought he was being the perfect husband for one final day, catching the light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. The room gradually quieted as I lifted my own glass, refilled with champagne despite my shaking hands. To new adventures indeed, I said, my voice carrying further than I expected across the suddenly silent ballroom. And to discoveries that change everything we thought we knew about the people we love. Bob's smile faltered for just a moment, uncertainty flickering across his features like a shadow passing over the sun. But the guests erupted in cheers again, interpreting my words as romantic sentiment rather than the warning they truly were. As I sipped my champagne, I caught sight of Diane Collins lingering near the back exit, her red dress a splash of color against the neutral walls. She wasn't supposed to be here, but then again, mistresses rarely follow proper etiquette. The evening continued around us like a perfectly choreographed dance, but beneath the surface, currents of tension ran deeper than the Connecticut River that flowed past our hometown of Millbrook. Bob worked the room with the ease of a man who had spent 40 years perfecting his public persona, accepting congratulations on our marriage while secretly planning its destruction. He moved from table to table, sharing stories of our early days, our children's accomplishments, the business he'd built from nothing into a thriving insurance agency that employed half the town. I watched him perform, this man I'd married fresh. Out of college when we were both young and full of dreams about growing old together, Bob Thompson had been the catch of our graduating class, handsome, ambitious, destined for success. I'd been Maggie Sullivan then, an English literature major with plans to teach and write novels in my spare time. We'd honeymooned in Niagara Falls, because it was all we could afford, staying in a modest motel and eating breakfast at diners, planning the beautiful life we'd build together. That life had been beautiful for a while. Bob's insurance agency had grown steadily, providing us with the colonial house on Elm Street where we'd raised Jennifer and David. I'd taught English at Millbrook High School for 30 years, watching generations of students discover Shakespeare and Steinbeck, coming home each day to dinners with my family, weekend trips to the lake house we'd bought when the business really took off, holidays filled with laughter and tradition. But somewhere along the way, probably around the time Bob hired Diane Collins as his personal secretary 3 years ago, the beautiful life had begun to crack. At first, the changes were subtle late nights at the office that became routine, weekend, work that couldn't wait until Monday, business trips that seemed to multiply like cancer cells. I'd attributed it to the stress of running a successful company, the natural evolution of a man approaching 70 who wanted to secure his legacy. The truth had come to light 6 months ago in the most mundane way possible. I'd been looking for Bob's reading glasses, which he'd misplaced again, checking his home office when I'd accidentally knocked over a stack of papers near his computer. As I'd gathered them up, a bank statement had caught my eye, an account I'd never seen before, with regular deposits that didn't match anything from the business books I helped maintain. That single piece of paper had led me down a rabbit hole that revealed the systematic dismantling of our shared life. Bob hadn't just been having an affair with Diane Collins, he'd been preparing to abandon our marriage with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. Joint accounts had been slowly drained. Properties had been quietly transferred to his name alone. Our retirement fund, the one we'd built together over 4 decades, had been diverted into investments I couldn't access. Most devastating of all were the printed emails I'd found hidden in his locked filing cabinet, the one he thought I didn't have a key to. Conversations between Bob and his divorce attorney, outlining strategies to minimize my settlement by painting me as an unstable, aging woman whose contributions to his success were negligible. Messages to Diane about their future together, describing me as a burden he'd finally be free of once the paperwork was finalized. The man who had promised to love me until death do us part had spent 18 months carefully plotting my financial and emotional destruction. But Bob had made one crucial mistake in his calculations. He'd underestimated the woman who had stood by his side for 40 years, the English teacher who had spent decades helping students analyze complex narratives, who understood character motivation and plot development better than most, the partner who had helped build his business from the ground up, who knew every client, every contract, every financial detail of Thompson and Harrison Insurance. While Bob had been busy planning his escape, I'd been quietly building my own strategy. The key to the filing cabinet had been duplicated years ago when Bob first started locking it, a precaution I'd taken when his secrecy had first made me uneasy. The home computer he thought was password protected had been accessed using information any wife of 40 years would know: his mother's maiden name, the date of our first kiss, the name of his childhood dog. I'd photographed documents, saved emails, recorded phone conversations using the small device my sister Carol had given me for Christmas, thinking it was just a cute gadget for recording family stories. Every transaction, every secret meeting, every lie had been carefully documented and stored in a safety deposit box Bob didn't know existed. 3 months ago, I'd hired Sam Rodriguez, a private investigator recommended by Janet Morrison, the divorce attorney I'd consulted in Hartford. Far enough from Millbrook that word wouldn't get back to Bob through the small-town gossip network. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sam had confirmed what I'd suspected and discovered what I hadn't imagined. The affair with Diane was just the tip of the iceberg. Bob had been skimming money from client accounts, using his reputation and position to manipulate elderly clients into unnecessary policies that padded his commission. The evidence we'd gathered wasn't just sufficient for a favorable divorce settlement. It was enough to destroy the reputation Bob had spent 4 decades building and potentially land him in prison for fraud. As the anniversary party continued, around me, I moved through the familiar motions of being the gracious hostess. I thanked guests for their gifts, posed for photos with our children, and accepted congratulations on reaching this milestone with the man everyone believed was my devoted husband. But underneath my composed exterior, I was counting down the hours until Monday morning, when Bob would arrive at his office to find federal investigators waiting for him. The cake-cutting ceremony approached, and Bob returned to my side, slipping his arm around my waist with practiced affection. Beautiful party, sweetheart," he murmured against my ear, his breath warm and familiar. "Thank you for organizing everything so perfectly." I turned to look at him, this man who had been my partner, my lover, my best friend for most of my adult life. Even now, knowing what I knew, seeing the deception written in every smile he'd given me for the past 18 months, I felt a flicker of the old affection. Bob was still handsome at 69, his silver hair thick and styled, his blue eyes bright with intelligence and charm. He looked like exactly what he was: a successful businessman, a pillar of the community, a man who had built something meaningful with his life. But he also looked like what he'd become: a stranger who saw our marriage as a contract to be terminated, who viewed my love as a liability to be managed, who had convinced himself that 40 years of partnership meant nothing compared to 18 months of passion with a woman young enough to be our daughter. "You're welcome," I replied, reaching up to straighten his tie with the same gentle gesture I'd made thousands of times before. I wanted tonight to be special, memorable. Bob smiled, completely missing the double meaning in my words. "It certainly is that. I can't believe we've made it 40 years, Maggie. Sometimes it feels like we just got married yesterday." "And sometimes," I said quietly, "it feels like we've been strangers for months." For a moment, his facade slipped, and I saw something flicker behind his eyes: uncertainty, perhaps even guilt. But then the moment passed, and he was back to being Bob Thompson, beloved husband and respected businessman, ready to cut the anniversary cake and accept the applause of our friends and family. The photographer called us forward, and we posed. With the elaborate cake Carol had ordered from the best bakery in Hartford, our hands joined on the silver knife as we'd done at our wedding 4 decades ago. The guests gathered around, phones and cameras capturing what they believed was a beautiful moment in a love story that had stood the test of time. "Make a wish," Jennifer called out from the crowd, her voice bright with happiness for her parents. Lasting marriage. Bob and I looked at each other across the pristine white frosting, and for a split second, I wondered if he would somehow sense what was coming, if the man who had known me better than anyone would recognize the steel beneath my smile. But he simply grinned and whispered, "I wish for many more years of adventure ahead." I closed my eyes and made my own wish that when everything came crashing down around him on Monday morning, Bob would finally understand the difference between love and possession, between partnership and control, between the woman he'd married and the one he'd underestimated for far too long. We cut the cake together as the crowd cheered, and I savored the sweetness on my tongue, knowing it would be the last moment of our marriage that would taste anything other than bitter. The last dance was yet to come, along with the final revelation that would make this anniversary celebration the most unforgettable day of Bob Thompson's life. But first, I had a performance to finish, a role to play until the curtain finally fell on the longest-running drama of my life. And I intended to make it a masterpiece. The receiving line stretched endlessly as guests approached to offer their congratulations and share memories of Bob and me throughout our 4 decades together. I stood beside my husband, my hand resting lightly on his arm, playing the role of the devoted wife with a precision that would have impressed the drama teacher at Millbrook High School. Each handshake, each kiss on the cheek, each heartfelt wish for many more years of happiness felt like another layer of armor protecting the steel resolve that had been growing inside me for months. Mrs. Henderson from our street corner approached with tears in her eyes, clutching a small wrapped gift. "Maggie, dear, 40 years is such an inspiration in this day and age. You two give the rest of us hope that true love really does last forever." She pressed the gift into my hands, her weathered fingers warm against mine. Harold and I celebrated our 38th last month, and we kept saying we hope we're as happy as the Thompsons when we reach 40. I smiled with what I hoped looked like genuine warmth, rather than the bitter irony that was churning in my stomach. "Thank you, Eleanor. That's so kind of you to say." Bob squeezed my shoulder, his fingers applying just enough pressure to remind, Me of his presence, his control, his expectation that I would continue this charade flawlessly. The line continued with Bob's golf buddies from the country club, colleagues from the insurance agency, neighbors who had watched our children grow up, teachers I had worked with during my 30 years in the classroom. Each interaction required me to summon memories of happier times, to reference shared experiences that now felt tainted by the knowledge of Bob's betrayal. When Tom Mitchell from the agency mentioned how lucky Bob was to have such a supportive wife who never complained about the long hours, I managed to keep my expression pleasant, even as my fingernails dug crescents into my palms. Maggie's always been understanding about the demands of building a business, Bob replied smoothly, his public voice warm with affection. She knew from the beginning that success requires sacrifice, and she's always been my greatest cheerleader. The words stung because they had once been true. I had been understanding about the long hours, the weekend work, the business trips that stretched longer than planned. I had believed in building something together, in making sacrifices for our shared future. What I hadn't realized was that somewhere along the way, Bob had started viewing my support as his due rather than my gift, my love as a resource to be managed rather than a treasure to be cherished. Father Mackenzie from St. Mary's Church approached, with his familiar gentle smile, the same expression he had worn when he married us 40 years ago in the small ceremony we could barely afford. "Margaret, Robert, what a blessing to see you both looking so radiant after all these years. Your marriage has been a testament to the power of commitment and faith." Bob straightened beside me, his chest puffing slightly with pride. He had always enjoyed the respect of the clergy, the acknowledgement of his standing in the community. "Thank you, Father. We've been blessed beyond measure." His hand found mine, fingers intertwining with a familiarity that should have been comforting, but instead felt like a performance for our audience. "I remember when you first came to see me about marriage counseling," Father Mackenzie continued, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone. "Such a young couple, so eager to build a life together. And look what you've accomplished: beautiful children, a thriving business, a home filled with love." Marriage counseling. The memory hit me like a physical blow, so unexpected that I had to grip Bob's hand tighter to keep from stumbling. We had been 26 and 24, just engaged, taking the required pre-marriage classes at the church. I remembered sitting in Father Mackenzie's study, nervous but excited, discussing our dreams for the future, our plans for children, our commitment to growing old together. Bob had been so earnest then, promising to love and honor me, to put our marriage first no matter what challenges we faced. "Those sessions changed everything for us," Bob said now, his voice taking on the nostalgic tone he used when telling stories about our early days. Father Mackenzie taught us that marriage isn't just about love. It's about choice. Choosing each other every single day, no matter what. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Bob stood there speaking about choosing each other while Diane Collins waited. Somewhere in the shadows, while divorce papers sat in his office safe, while bank accounts I had helped fill were being systematically emptied. I wondered if he felt any shame at all, or if the lies had become so natural that he believed them himself. "Indeed," I managed to say, my voice steady despite the emotional earthquake happening inside me. "Choice is everything." As Father Mackenzie moved on, Bob leaned closer to me, his breath warm against my ear. "You're doing beautifully tonight, sweetheart. I know this has been a lot of work for you, organizing everything so perfectly." There was something in his tone that I couldn't quite identify, almost apologetic, as if he was trying to ease his conscience by acknowledging my efforts. The band began playing our wedding song, "The Way You Look Tonight," and couples started moving toward the dance floor. Bob turned to me with his most charming smile, the one that had first captured my heart in Professor Williams' American literature class. "Shall we show them how it's done, Mrs. Thompson?" I allowed him to lead me onto the polished wooden floor, his hand settling at my waist with the practiced ease of 40 years of dancing together. We had always moved well together, Bob and I. At our wedding, we had been so nervous that we had barely managed to get through the song without stepping on each other's feet. But over the years, we had developed a rhythm, an unspoken communication that made us graceful partners, whether we were dancing at the country club or navigating the complexities of raising children and building a business. Now, as we swayed to the familiar melody, I was acutely aware of every point of contact between us. Bob's hand on my back, warm through the silk of my dress. His fingers intertwined with mine, calloused from weekend projects around the house, but still gentle. The scent of his cologne, the same brand he had worn since our honeymoon, mixed with the faint smell of champagne on his breath. This was the man who had held me through morning sickness with both pregnancies, who had cried with me when we miscarried between Jennifer and David, who had danced with me in our kitchen on countless ordinary evenings when the children were young and life felt impossibly sweet. But it was also the man who had been lying to me for 18 months, who saw me as an obstacle to overcome rather than a partner to cherish, who had reduced 40 years of marriage to a financial transaction to be managed and minimized. "Remember our first dance?" Bob murmured, his cheek brushing against my hair. "You were so worried about messing up in front of everyone." I was terrified, I admitted, because that memory, at least, was still pure. Your mother had spent weeks trying to teach me that elaborate waltz, and I was convinced I would forget everything the moment the music started. Bob chuckled, the sound vibrating through his chest against mine. "You were perfect. You've always been perfect, Maggie." The words should have been romantic, but there was something hollow about them, as if he was reciting lines from a script rather than speaking from his heart. Around us, other couples joined the dance floor. Jennifer and her husband Mark, married 15 years now and still obviously in love. David dancing with Linda Patterson, my best friend who had flown in from Arizona for the celebration. Carol and her husband Miguel, who had driven up from New York City despite Miguel's fear of small-town gatherings. These were people who truly knew Bob and me, who had witnessed our marriage through good times and bad, who believed they were celebrating something real and lasting. The song ended, and Bob spun me gently before pulling me back into his arms for a final dip that made the watching crowd applaud. As he brought me upright, his eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw something that might have been regret flickering in their blue depths. But then it was gone, replaced by the confident smile of a man who believed he had successfully navigated another social obligation. "Beautiful as always," he said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. 40 years. And you still take my breath away." The receiving line resumed as the band played softer background music, and I found myself trapped in an endless cycle of gracious responses to well-meaning comments. Colleagues from the school district reminisced about faculty parties where Bob and I had been the couple everyone looked up to. Former students, now adults with children of their own, stopped by to thank me for my influence on their lives and to congratulate us on reaching such an impressive milestone. Sarah Chen, who had been in my advanced placement English class 15 years ago and was now a successful journalist, took my hands in both of hers. "Mrs. Thompson, I just wanted to thank you again for believing in me when I wanted to switch from business to journalism. My parents thought I was crazy, but you said following your passion was the only way to live a meaningful life." The words hit harder than I expected. Following your passion. How many times had I given that advice to students who felt trapped by others' expectations? How many times had I encouraged young women to pursue their dreams, to not settle for lives that didn't fulfill them? And yet here I was, at 67, finally taking my own advice by refusing to accept a marriage that had become a lie. "I'm so glad you listened to your heart," I told Sarah, meaning it more than she could possibly know. "It's never too late to choose the life you really want." Bob was engaged in conversation with Mike Harrison about the transition plans for the insurance agency, their voices low but animated. I caught fragments of their discussion, something about client lists and profit-sharing agreements that would need to be finalized before Bob's retirement became official. Mike seemed genuinely sad to be losing his partner, completely unaware that Bob's retirement was really an escape plan that would leave him holding the bag when the federal investigation began. The thought of Mike's impending shock bothered me, more than I expected. He was a good man, honest and hardworking, who had trusted Bob completely for 15 years. The discovery that his business partner had been embezzling from client accounts would devastate him personally and professionally, but I couldn't warn him without revealing my own knowledge, and I had come too far to jeopardize everything now. As the evening progressed, I excused myself periodically to check on catering details, to refresh my lipstick, to steal moments of solitude in the ladies' room where I could drop the mask for a few precious seconds. During one of these breaks, I encountered Diane Collins near the back entrance to the country club, smoking a cigarette despite the no-smoking policy. She was even prettier up close than I had expected, with the kind of carefully maintained appearance that comes from regular salon visits and expensive skincare. Her red dress was perfectly fitted, showing off a figure that 40 years and 2 children had never touched. She looked young and fresh and uncomplicated, everything that I was not. "Mrs. Thompson," she said when she noticed me, her voice carefully neutral. She dropped the cigarette and crushed it under her designer heel. "Beautiful party. Your husband spoke so fondly of you during the planning." The casual mention of her involvement in planning my anniversary party was like a slap. Of course, Bob would have discussed the details with his secretary, his lover, his future wife. Perhaps they had even laughed together about the irony of celebrating a marriage that would soon be dissolved. "Thank you," I replied, my voice equally neutral. "I wasn't aware you were invited." A faint blush colored her cheeks. "I wasn't, officially. But Bob thought it would be strange if his secretary of 3 years didn't make an appearance. For appearances' sake." Appearances. Everything in Bob's world came down to appearances, to maintaining the carefully constructed image of success and respectability. Even his affair had to be managed. His mistress coached on proper behavior at his wife's anniversary party. "Well," I said, forcing a smile, "I hope you're enjoying yourself." "It's lovely," Diane replied, but her eyes were wary as if she sensed some undercurrent she couldn't identify. "You've done a wonderful job with everything." I studied her face, looking for signs of guilt or shame or even triumph, but found only nervousness. She was young enough to be my daughter, probably unaware of the full extent of Bob's financial machinations, possibly even believing that she was genuinely in love rather than simply the latest conquest of a man approaching 70 who needed validation of his continued appeal. "Diane," I said carefully, "has Bob ever mentioned his plans for retirement to you?" The question clearly caught her off guard. "Just general things, about wanting to slow down, maybe travel more." She was lying, but not very skillfully. Bob had obviously coached her on what to say if questioned, but hadn't prepared her for a direct conversation with his wife. "I see. Well, I hope his plans work out exactly as he expects them to." There was something in my tone that made her take a step backward, her eyes widening slightly. For just a moment, I let her see past the gracious hostess facade to the steel underneath. The woman who had been gathering evidence and building a case while Bob thought she was obliviously planning his farewell party. "I should get back inside," Diane said quickly. "People might wonder where I am." "Yes," I agreed. "We wouldn't want people to wonder." She hurried away, leaving me alone in the corridor with the scent of her expensive perfume and the satisfaction of having planted a seed of doubt in her mind. Let her spend the rest of the evening wondering what I knew, what I suspected, what I might be planning. It was a small preview of the uncertainty that was about to consume both her and Bob. When I returned to the ballroom, Bob was in the middle of a story about our early days in the business, how we had started with nothing but determination and a small loan from his father. It was a story he told often, but tonight I noticed how it had evolved over the years. In Bob's current version, he was the sole architect of their success, the visionary who had built an empire through sheer force of will. My contributions had been edited out so gradually that even I hadn't noticed until now. "Those were lean years," he was saying to a group of younger couples. But Maggie never complained, never doubted that we would make it work. She knew how to stretch a dollar and make a house feel like a home even when we could barely afford furniture. It was true, but incomplete. I had stretched dollars because I had managed our finances, had created detailed budgets, and found ways to save money that Bob never even knew about. I had made our house feel like a home because I had worked full-time as a teacher while also handling all the domestic responsibilities, from cooking and cleaning to managing our social calendar and maintaining relationships with both our families. I had been a full partner in building our life together, not simply a supportive background figure. But that was Bob's gift, and perhaps his curse, the ability to rewrite history until it matched his preferred narrative. In his mind, he probably genuinely believed that he had been the driving force behind our success, that my role had been peripheral, at best. It made his current betrayal easier to justify, I supposed. It was simpler to abandon a wife who had been merely supportive than one who had been truly essential. The cake-cutting ceremony approached, and our children gathered around us with bright smiles and cameras ready to capture the moment. Jennifer looked radiant in her navy blue dress, her auburn hair styled elegantly for the occasion. She had inherited my love of literature and Bob's head for business, building a successful career as a literary agent while raising 2 teenagers. David stood beside her, handsome in his father's mold, but with a gentleness that Bob had lost somewhere along the way. He worked as a social worker in Denver, choosing service over profit in a way that had initially disappointed Bob, but which I had always admired. "Dad, tell everyone about the first anniversary cake disaster," Jennifer called out, referring to a family legend about the collapsed cake I had attempted to make during our first year of marriage. Bob grinned and launched into the familiar story, describing my ambitious 3-layer creation that had toppled over just as we were about to cut it. "Your mother cried for an hour," he said, his arm around my waist. "But we ate it anyway, sitting on the kitchen floor with forks, and it was the best cake I've ever tasted." The memory was real and sweet, but hearing Bob tell it now felt like watching someone else's life being performed on stage. That young couple, so in love and so committed to building something beautiful together, felt like strangers to me now. Or perhaps they weren't strangers at all. Perhaps that young woman was exactly who I was returning to be, the person who refused to settle for less than she deserved, who was willing to fight for what was right, who understood that sometimes love meant having the courage to walk away. As we posed for more photos and accepted more congratulations, I caught sight of Carol near the bar, her dark eyes scanning the crowd with the alertness of someone who sensed undercurrents others missed. She had been my anchor throughout this ordeal, the only person who knew the full extent of what I had discovered and what I was planning. Her presence here tonight felt like having a lifeline, someone who could witness what was happening and confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. The band announced the last dance, and couples began moving toward the floor for a final slow song. Bob extended his hand to me with courtly gallantry, and I accepted it with the grace of a woman who had been dancing this particular dance for 40 years. As we moved together one last time, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of what was ending. Not just a marriage, but an entire identity, a whole way of being in the world. For 40 years, I had been half of a couple, part of a unit that had faced every challenge together. I had been Bob's wife, the children's mother, the teacher who went home to a family, the woman who always had a partner for social events, and someone to share both triumphs and disappointments. In less than 48 hours, I would be something I hadn't been since I was 27 years old, a woman on her own, responsible only to herself, free to make choices based solely on what I wanted rather than what we needed. The prospect. was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The final guests lingered in the country club's marble foyer, their voices echoing off the high ceilings as they exchanged final pleasantries and collected their coats from the attendant. Bob worked the remaining crowd with the practiced ease of a politician, shaking hands and accepting final congratulations on our milestone anniversary. I stood beside him, my emerald dress now feeling heavier after hours of performance, but my smile never wavering as we played out the last act of this elaborate charade. "Maggie, you outdid yourself tonight," called out Patricia Wells, the mayor's wife, as she adjusted her wrap around her shoulders. "That dinner was absolutely exquisite. You'll have to give me the name of your caterer for our holiday party next month." "Of course," I replied smoothly, though internally I wondered if Patricia would still want party planning advice from me once the news broke about Bob's arrest and our divorce. "I'll email you the details tomorrow." Bob's hand found the small of my back, a gesture that had once been comforting but now felt possessive, controlling. "My wife has always had impeccable taste," he said, his voice carrying the warmth that had charmed Millbrook society for decades. "I'm lucky she agreed to take on a project like me." The self-deprecating humor was vintage Bob Thompson, the successful businessman who remained humble enough to acknowledge his wife's contributions while simultaneously positioning himself as the prize she had won. The comment drew appreciative chuckles from the departing guests, but I heard the subtext clearly. This was his way of reminding everyone that I should be grateful for the life he had provided, the status he had given me, the security of being Mrs. Robert Thompson. As the last car pulled away from the circular drive, Bob turned to me with what appeared to be genuine affection, softening his features. The parking lot lights cast long shadows across his face, making him look older than his 69 years, more vulnerable than the confident man who had commanded the room all evening. "Well, Mrs. Thompson," he said, using the formal address that had been a private joke between us for decades, "I think we can officially call that a success. 40 years celebrated in style." I studied his expression in the dim light, looking for any sign that he suspected what was coming, any indication that his guilty conscience was making him nervous about my unusually composed demeanor throughout the evening. But I saw only satisfaction, and perhaps a hint of relief, that he had successfully navigated another social obligation without arousing suspicion about his double life. It was a beautiful evening, I agreed, allowing him to help me into his Mercedes, the same model he had been driving for the past 5 years. Everything about Bob's life was carefully curated for maximum impact luxury without ostentation, success without vulgarity, comfort without excess. Even his infidelity was tasteful, conducted with his secretary rather than some random woman, planned with the same attention to detail he brought to his business dealings. The drive home to Elm Street took less than 10 minutes, but it felt like crossing a bridge between two different worlds. Behind us was the glittering celebration, the public affirmation of our marriage, the community's recognition of what appeared to be a love story for the ages. Ahead was our house, the private space where we would sleep in the same bed for what I knew would be the final time, where Bob would continue his performance for an audience of one until Monday morning shattered his carefully constructed plans. Our colonial-style home looked exactly as it had when we left earlier that evening, but I saw it now with different eyes. The perfectly manicured lawn that Bob insisted on maintaining himself, the flower gardens I had planted and tended for 35 years, the addition we had built when the children were teenagers. All of it would soon be divided up by lawyers and appraisers, reduced to line items on legal documents. The house that had been our sanctuary would become another battlefield in the war Bob had declared without my knowledge. Inside, Bob poured himself a scotch from the crystal decanter in his study, the same single malt he had been drinking since our first anniversary when we could barely afford such luxuries. He had developed expensive tastes over the years, in everything from alcohol to automobiles to women, it seemed. The irony wasn't lost on me that he was celebrating the end of our marriage with whiskey I had given him for Christmas 3 years ago. "Nightcap?" he offered, holding up a second glass. "No, thank you," I replied, though I desperately wanted something to calm my nerves. "I think I'll go up and get out of this dress. It's been a long day." Bob nodded absently, already settling into his leather armchair with the newspaper he hadn't had time to read that morning. This was our normal routine after social events. He would decompress with a drink and catch up on the news while I handled the mundane tasks of ending the evening. I would hang up our formal clothes, remove my makeup, set out his pills for his blood pressure medication, and perform all the small acts of care that wives do automatically. After 40 years of marriage, tonight, those familiar rituals felt like archaeological artifacts from a vanished civilization, remnants of a way of life that was about to become extinct. As I climbed the stairs to our bedroom, my hand trailing along the banister Bob had refinished. Himself, when we first moved in, I wondered if he felt any of the same melancholy I was experiencing. Did he have moments of genuine regret about destroying what we had built together, or was he simply relieved to be approaching the finish line of his escape plan? In our master bedroom, I hung my emerald dress carefully in the walk-in closet Bob had surprised me with for our 20th anniversary, back when surprises were gifts rather than betrayals. The dress would probably go to charity eventually, along with most of the clothes I had accumulated during 4 decades of playing the successful businessman's wife. Maggie Thompson's wardrobe wouldn't be appropriate for whatever life Maggie Sullivan was about to create for herself. I sat at my vanity to remove my jewelry, each piece carrying its own memory. The pearl earrings Bob had given me for our 10th anniversary, when David was 5 and Jennifer was 7, and we still believed we would grow old together. The diamond tennis bracelet from our 25th, when Bob's business was thriving and the future seemed limitless. The emerald necklace from last Christmas, when he was already deep into his affair with Diane, but still going through the motions of being a devoted husband. Had he chosen that necklace with guilty conscience, trying to assuage his sense of betrayal with expensive jewelry? Or had Diane helped him select it, the mistress advising the husband on appropriate gifts for the wife he was planning to discard? The thought made my stomach turn, and I quickly unfastened the clasp and placed the necklace in its velvet box, closing the lid with more force than necessary. The bathroom adjoining our bedroom was another testament to Bob's success, with marble, countertops, a jetted tub, and a separate shower large enough for 2 people. We had remodeled it just 3 years ago, during what I now realized was the early phase of Bob's affair. I had been so excited about the renovation, spending hours with the designer selecting tiles and fixtures, imagining long soaks in the tub as we entered our golden years together. Bob had been enthusiastic about the project too, but now I wondered if he had been planning even then to enjoy it with someone else. As I went through my skincare routine, I caught sight of myself in the mirror and was surprised by what I saw. Despite everything I had learned, despite the emotional turmoil of the past 6 months, I looked remarkably composed. My skin was still relatively smooth for 67. My gray hair was elegantly styled, and my green eyes still held the intelligence that had first attracted Bob when we were college students. I wasn't the young woman he had married, but I wasn't the discarded elderly wife of his narrative either. I was something more dangerous than he had calculated, a woman who had found her strength. When I emerged from the bathroom in my silk nightgown, Bob was already in bed, reading glasses perched on his nose as he reviewed what appeared to be business documents. Even on the night of our 40th anniversary, he couldn't completely disconnect from work, though I suspected the papers had more to do with his retirement plans than current business. "Good party tonight," he said without looking up from his reading. Jennifer seemed especially happy. I think she's been worried about us lately, wondering if we're doing okay. The casual mention of our daughter's concern hit me unexpectedly. Jennifer had indeed seemed more attentive than usual over the past few months, calling more frequently, asking pointed questions about how Bob and I were getting along. She had inherited my intuition along with my love of literature, and she had probably sensed the undercurrents in our marriage long before I had been ready to acknowledge them myself. Children always worry about their parents, I replied, settling into my side of the king-sized bed we had shared for so many years. It's natural for her to want us to be happy. Bob finally looked at me over his reading glasses, and for a moment, I saw something that might have been regret flickering in his expression. We have been happy, haven't we, Maggie? I mean, overall, looking back at everything we've built together? The question seemed genuine, as if he was seeking some kind of absolution from me before he proceeded with his plan to destroy our marriage. It was the closest he had come to acknowledging that something was wrong between us, though he was still incapable of taking responsibility for creating the problems. We had many happy years, I answered carefully, choosing my words to avoid an outright lie while not giving him the comfort he was seeking. But happiness isn't just about looking back, Bob. It's about who we choose to be going forward. He studied my face in the lamplight, and I wondered if he could sense the steel beneath my surface calm, the resolution that had been building inside me since the day I discovered his betrayal. But Bob had never been particularly perceptive about my inner life, had never seemed interested in the thoughts and feelings I didn't voluntarily share. It was one of the fundamental disconnects in our marriage that he had fallen in love with. The version of me he found convenient, rather than the complete woman I actually was. "You're right," he said finally, returning to his papers. "The future is what matters now." If only he knew how right he was, and how different that future was going to be from what he expected. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp November sunshine that made Connecticut's autumn foliage spectacular. I woke before Bob, as had become my habit over the past few months, and lay quietly in our bed listening to his steady breathing while I mentally reviewed the events that would unfold over the next few days. By Wednesday, Bob would be in federal custody. By Friday, our assets would be frozen and our marriage would be headline news in the Millbrook Gazette. By next Sunday, I would be living in a different world entirely. Bob stirred beside me, reaching automatically for his phone to check his messages before his eyes were fully open. This too had become routine over the past year, the immediate connection to his business and, I now knew, to Diane Collins. I watched him scroll through his texts and emails, his expression shifting from sleepy contentment to focused attention as he absorbed whatever communications had arrived overnight. "Anything important?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Sunday mornings were when Bob handled what he called administrative details, which I now understood included coordinating with Diane about their travel plans and communicating with his divorce attorney about asset protection strategies. "Just some issues with the Chicago transition," he replied, not quite meeting my eyes. "Mike wants to discuss the client handoffs before I finalize anything." Mike Harrison's name sent another stab of guilt through me. In 48 hours, he would discover that his trusted business partner had been systematically defrauding their shared clients, and the shock would probably destroy him personally and professionally. But there was no way to warn him without compromising my own position, and I had come too far to jeopardize everything now. Bob swung his legs out of bed and padded toward the bathroom, his movements still graceful despite his age. He had always been a handsome man, and the years had been kind to him in the way they usually were to successful men who could afford personal trainers and expensive skincare. Looking at him now, it was easy to understand why a younger woman might find him attractive, might believe his promises about leaving his elderly wife for a more exciting future. But what Diane Collins didn't understand, what Bob himself seemed to have forgotten, was that attractiveness based on power and money was ultimately fragile. When federal agents arrested him on Monday morning, when his reputation crumbled and his assets were frozen, when the man she thought she knew was revealed to be a criminal who had stolen from vulnerable elderly clients, her infatuation would evaporate like morning mist. I made coffee and prepared Bob's usual Sunday breakfast: poached eggs, wheat toast, fresh fruit while he showered and dressed for his morning golf game. This domestic routine had anchored our weekends for decades. The comfortable rhythm of a long marriage where each partner knew their role instinctively. But today, it felt like a performance, a final rehearsal before the curtain fell on the life we had built together. "The Hendersons called last night after we got home," Bob said as he settled at our kitchen table with the newspaper. "They wanted to thank us for a wonderful evening and to say how much they admire our marriage. Frank said he hopes he and Betty make it to 40 years looking as happy as we do." The comment was delivered casually, but I heard the subtext. Bob was reminding me of our public image, of how much I stood to lose if I caused any kind of scandal. In his mind, I was trapped by my investment in our social standing, too concerned about community opinion to risk the embarrassment of a messy divorce. What he didn't understand was that the woman who had spent 40 years caring desperately about what other people thought was gone, replaced by someone who cared more about justice than reputation, more about integrity than social status. The Maggie Thompson who had hosted charity events and smiled through business dinners was about to be retired permanently. "That's nice," I replied, setting his breakfast in front of him with the same care I had shown for 4 decades. "I'm sure they'll reach 40 years just fine. Some couples are meant to last." Bob looked up from his eggs, something in my tone catching his attention. "And some aren't?" I met his gaze steadily, allowing him to see just a hint of the steel that had been hardening inside me for months. "Some couples discover they want very different things from life. When that happens, the kindest thing is to admit it and move on." For a moment, uncertainty flickered across Bob's features, as if he was finally beginning to sense that I knew more than I was revealing. But then his confidence reasserted itself, and he returned to his breakfast with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had everything under control. "Well," he said between bites, "I suppose every marriage goes through phases. The important thing is commitment, sticking together through the rough patches." The hypocrisy was breathtaking, but I simply nodded and refilled his coffee cup, playing the role of the devoted wife for a few more hours. By tomorrow evening, Bob would understand exactly how rough the patches were about to become, and how little his commitment had meant when tested against his desire for a younger woman and a more exciting life. As he left for his golf game, Bob kissed my cheek with the same casual affection he had shown for years, completely unaware that it would be the last time he would touch me as his wife. I watched his Mercedes pull out of our driveway and felt a strange mixture of sadness and anticipation wash over me. 40 years of marriage were ending, but something new was beginning, something that belonged entirely to me. The house felt different with Bob gone, quieter, but also more peaceful, as if it too was preparing for the transformation that was coming. I walked through the rooms we had shared for so many years, seeing them with the detachment of someone who was already beginning to let go. The living room where we had celebrated the children's achievements and mourned family losses. The dining room where we had hosted countless dinner parties and holiday gatherings. The family room where we had watched our children grow up and shared thousands of ordinary evenings. All of it had been real once. All of it had mattered. But that life belonged to a different woman, one who had believed in happy endings and the permanence of love. The woman I was becoming understood that sometimes the most courageous thing you could do was walk away from a beautiful lie and choose an uncertain but honest truth. Tomorrow would bring the beginning of the end, and I was finally ready for it. Monday morning arrived with an unseasonable warmth that made the November air feel deceptively gentle. I stood at our kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, watching Bob load his golf clubs into the Mercedes with the same methodical precision he brought to everything in his life. He was whistling softly, some old tune from our college days, and the sound carried across our quiet neighborhood like a melody from a forgotten world. In 3 hours, he would arrive at Thompson and Harrison Insurance to find federal agents waiting in his office. In 6 hours, news of his arrest would be spreading through Millbrook like wildfire. In 12 hours, our marriage would be reduced to headlines in the evening news. But for now, in this suspended moment before everything changed forever, Bob Thompson was still the successful businessman, respected community member, and devoted husband he had always appeared to be. He looked up from his car and caught sight of me in the window, raising his hand in the casual wave that had punctuated thousands of ordinary mornings throughout our marriage. I raised my own hand in response, a gesture that felt both familiar and surreal, like waving goodbye to a ghost. Bob had no idea he was seeing his wife for the last time. No concept that the woman in the window was no longer the person he thought he had married 40 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me that Bob was spending his final hours of freedom on a golf course, playing the same game that had provided him with alibis for so many of his meetings with Diane Collins. How many times over the past 18 months had he told me he was at the country club when he was actually in a hotel room with his secretary? How many Saturday afternoons had I spent alone, believing my husband was improving his handicap when he was actually perfecting his deception? As his car disappeared around the corner, I felt a strange lightness settle over me, as if a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had suddenly been lifted. The performance was finally over. No more pretending to believe his lies, no more smiling through his casual cruelties, no more maintaining the fiction that our marriage was anything other than an elaborate charade designed to protect his reputation, while he systematically dismantled our shared life. I moved through our house with purposeful efficiency, gathering the few personal items I couldn't bear to leave behind. The photo album from our honeymoon, filled with pictures of two young people who genuinely believed love could conquer anything. My grandmother's china, which had survived the Depression and 2 world wars and deserved better than to be divided up in a contentious divorce. The first edition of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice that Bob had given me for our 5th anniversary. Back when he still understood that books were more precious to me than jewelry, each item I packed carried its own emotional weight, its own collection of memories that would have to be sorted through and processed in the months ahead. But there wasn't time for sentimentality now. Carol would be arriving within the hour, to drive me to Hartford, where I would spend the day in Janet Morrison's office, coordinating the legal avalanche that was about to bury Bob's carefully constructed new life. The phone rang as I was closing my suitcase, and Bob's name appeared on the caller ID. For a moment, I considered not answering, but curiosity won out over caution. "Maggie?" His voice carried an unusual note of uncertainty. "I just got to the club and realized I forgot my blood pressure medication. Could you bring it by the office when you get a chance?" The mundane request was so perfectly normal, so completely characteristic of the Bob who had been my partner for 4 decades, that I felt an unexpected stab of grief. This was the man who had once been so focused on taking care of his family that he would call home about forgotten medication. When had that considerate husband been replaced by the calculating stranger who was planning to abandon me without a backward glance? "Of course," I heard myself saying. "I'll drop it off this morning." "Thanks, sweetheart. You're a lifesaver." The casual endearment hit me like a physical blow. Even now, even as he was preparing to divorce me and steal everything we had built together, Bob could slip back into the language of affection as easily as putting on a familiar coat. It was perhaps the most devastating aspect of his betrayal that he had never stopped being capable of kindness, had never lost the ability to be the man I had fallen in love with, but had chosen instead to save that version of himself for someone else. After hanging up, I sat on our bed for several minutes, staring at the phone and feeling the full weight of what I was about to set in motion. There was still time to change course, still a possibility that I could confront Bob privately, demand an explanation, attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of our marriage. For 40 years, that had been my instinct to fix things, to smooth over problems, to find ways to preserve what we had built together, regardless of the cost to my own dignity. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that some betrayals were too profound to forgive, some lies too comprehensive to overlook. Bob hadn't just been unfaithful. He had systematically stolen from vulnerable elderly clients, manipulated our joint finances to leave me with nothing, and spent 18 months planning a future that deliberately excluded the woman who had given him 4 decades of her life. I placed his blood pressure medication in my purse and drove to downtown Millbrook for the last time as Mrs. Robert Thompson. The Thompson and Harrison Insurance Building occupied a prime corner location on Main Street, a 3-story brick structure that Bob had purchased and renovated 15 years ago, when the business really began to flourish. I had been so proud of him then, so impressed by his vision and determination in creating something substantial in our small town. The brass nameplate by the front entrance still gleamed in the morning sun, a testament to the reputation Bob had, spent decades building and was about to lose in a single morning. The receptionist, a young woman named Amy who had worked for the agency for 2 years, greeted me with the warmth reserved for the boss's wife. "Mrs. Thompson, how lovely to see you. Mr. Thompson is in his office reviewing client files." I smiled and made my way up the familiar staircase to Bob's corner office, the medication feeling heavier in my purse with each step. Through his open door, I could see him bent over his desk, reading glasses perched on his nose as he studied what appeared to be legal documents. Even now, even knowing what I knew, he cut an impressive figure in his tailored suit and silk tie. Every inch the successful executive who had built something meaningful from nothing. "Forgotten medication delivery service," I announced from his doorway, forcing lightness into my voice. Bob looked up with genuine pleasure, the expression of a man who was genuinely happy to see his wife despite everything he was planning to do to her. "Maggie, you're an angel. I don't know what I'd do without you." The irony was so profound it took my breath away. In approximately 2 hours, Bob would discover exactly what he would do without me, and it wouldn't be nearly as comfortable as he had imagined. I placed the small bottle on his desk next to a stack of papers that I now recognized as client account summaries, evidence of the systematic theft that had funded his affair and his escape plan. "Don't forget to take it with lunch," I said, the domestic concern so automatic that it seemed to come from muscle memory rather than conscious thought. Bob stood and moved around his desk to embrace me, his arms encircling me with the same casual affection he had shown that morning and thousands of mornings before. For a moment, I allowed myself to sink into the familiar comfort of his embrace, to remember what it felt like to believe that this man would protect me, cherish me, grow old beside me. "Thank you," he murmured against my hair, "for everything. I know I don't say it enough, but you've been the best partner a man could ask for." The words were so close to what I had longed to hear from him over the past months of growing distance that they felt like a cruel joke. Bob Thompson could still access the language of love when it served his purposes, could still summon the warmth that had made me fall for him in the first place. But those feelings were no longer connected to any genuine intention to honor our marriage or protect my welfare. I pulled back to look at his face, memorizing the features I had studied for 40 years, but would never see again with the eyes of a wife. "Bob," I said quietly, "do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had made different choices?" Something flickered behind his eyes, a shadow of discomfort that suggested my question had hit closer to home than he wanted to acknowledge. "Different how?" "If we had been more honest with each other. If we had talked about what we really wanted instead of assuming we knew." Bob's hands dropped from my shoulders, and he stepped back slightly, his executive persona reasserting itself as it always did when conversations became too personal. "I think we've done pretty well for ourselves, Maggie. 40 years, 2 great kids, a comfortable life. Not everyone can say that." It was classic Bob deflection through accomplishment, avoiding emotional complexity by focusing on measurable success. But I pressed on, driven by a need to understand whether any part of the man I had loved was still accessible beneath the calculating stranger he had become. "But are you happy, Bob? Really, truly happy with the life we've built?" "Mo?" The question hung between us like a challenge, demanding more honesty than Bob had shown in months. For a moment, I thought he might actually answer, might give me some glimpse into the internal process that had led him to choose betrayal over renewal, deception over difficult conversations. Instead, he glanced at his watch and moved back toward his desk. I should get back to these files. Mike's coming in later to discuss the transition timeline. The dismissal was so complete, so characteristic of Bob's inability to engage with anything that threatened his comfortable narratives, that I felt the last vestige of my 40-year-old love for him finally die. Whatever we had been, whatever we might have been, was truly over. "Of course," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'll let you get back to work." I turned to leave, then paused in his doorway for one final look at the man who had been my husband, my partner, my greatest love, and my most profound disappointment. Bob was already absorbed in his papers again, his attention completely focused on the details of dismantling our shared business, just as he had dismantled our shared marriage with surgical precision and emotional detachment. "Goodbye, Bob," I said quietly. He looked up with a distracted smile. "See you tonight, sweetheart." But we both knew, though only I understood it, that tonight would bring revelations that would make such casual domestic exchanges impossible forever. I drove straight from Bob's office to Hartford, where Carol was waiting in Janet Morrison's reception area with the grim expression of a woman preparing for battle. Over the past 6 months, my sister had become my closest ally and fiercest advocate, the one person who had never questioned my decision to gather evidence against Bob, or encouraged me to try to save a marriage that had become a lie. "How are you holding up?" she asked as we embraced in the lawyer's office. "Better than I expected," I replied, and realized it was true. The hardest part had been maintaining the pretense, playing the role of the devoted wife while gathering evidence of Bob's betrayal. Now that the performance was over, I felt lighter, more myself than I had in months. Janet Morrison entered her office with the bearing of a woman who had spent 30 years helping other women navigate the wreckage of failed marriages. She was younger than me by perhaps a decade, but her gray hair and no-nonsense demeanor suggested someone who had seen every possible variation of marital betrayal and knew exactly how to respond to each one. "Are you ready for this, Maggie?" she asked, settling behind her desk with a thick folder that contained the evidence Sam Rodriguez and I had gathered over months of investigation. "I'm ready," I replied, and meant it completely. What followed was 3 hours of systematic legal preparation, coordinating with federal investigators, reviewing asset protection strategies, and finalizing the paperwork that would freeze every account Bob had access to before he could transfer another dollar to his offshore investments. Janet had worked with cases like mine before, she explained, where successful men had used their business expertise to systematically steal from their wives while maintaining perfect public facades. "The federal charges will be filed simultaneously with the divorce papers," she explained. "Bank fraud, wire fraud, elder abuse for the client accounts he's been manipulating. He'll be arrested this afternoon, and by evening, every asset will be frozen pending investigation." "And Diane Collins?" "She'll likely be questioned as a potential accomplice, depending on how much she knew about the financial irregularities. But your main concern should be protecting yourself and securing what's rightfully yours." As we worked through the details, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction settling over me. For months, I had felt helpless, trapped by Bob's superior knowledge of our finances and his carefully constructed plans for our future. But piece by piece, with Janet's help and Sam's investigations, I had built a case that would not only protect my interests, but ensure that Bob faced real consequences for his choices. The phone rang at 2:47 p.m., and Janet answered with the crisp professionalism that had made her one of Hartford's most successful divorce attorneys. "It's done," she said after hanging up. "Robert Thompson is in federal custody. The assets are frozen and the media has been notified about the charges." I closed my eyes and felt 40 years of marriage officially end with those simple words. Bob was no longer my problem to solve, my burden to carry, my betrayal to endure. He was now the legal system's responsibility, and I was finally free to discover who Maggie Sullivan had become after 4 decades of being Mrs. Robert Thompson. The drive back to Millbrook felt like traveling through a different landscape, even though nothing had changed except my status as a married woman. Carol drove while I sat in the passenger seat, watching familiar landmarks pass by and trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. By now, news of Bob's arrest would be spreading through our small town like wildfire, transforming me from the envied wife of a successful businessman into the betrayed woman whose husband had been arrested for federal crimes. But instead of shame, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: relief. No more pretending. No more wondering when the other shoe would drop. No more lying awake at night worrying about financial security while Bob slept peacefully beside me, planning my destruction. The worst had finally happened, and I had not only survived it, but orchestrated it. My phone buzzed constantly with texts and calls from friends and neighbors who had heard the news, but I wasn't ready to talk to anyone yet. Tomorrow would bring conversations, explanations, and the inevitable questions about how much I had known and when I had known it. Tonight, I simply wanted to be alone with the woman I was becoming, to sit quietly in my sister's guest room and plan the next chapter of a life that belonged entirely to me. The Millbrook Gazette's evening edition would feature Bob's arrest as the front-page story, complete with details about the federal charges and speculation about the future of Thompson and Harrison Insurance. The same newspaper that had covered our engagement announcement 41 years ago, our children's graduations, and countless social events where we had appeared as the perfect couple, would now document the spectacular implosion of everything Bob had spent his life building. But buried in the coverage, relegated to a small paragraph near the end of the article, would be a detail that most readers would overlook, but that filled me with profound satisfaction. The investigation had been triggered. The reporter would note, by evidence provided by an unnamed source with intimate knowledge of the defendant's business practices. No one would ever know that Mrs. Robert Thompson had spent 6 months systematically building the case that brought down her husband's criminal enterprise. But I would carry that knowledge like a secret source of strength for the rest of my life. 3 months later, I stood in the bedroom of my new apartment in downtown Hartford, hanging the emerald dress I had worn to our anniversary party in a closet that belonged entirely to me. The divorce had been finalized the previous week, with Bob agreeing to a settlement from his remaining assets that would allow me to live comfortably for the rest of my life. He was serving 18 months in federal prison, his law license suspended, his reputation in ruins. Diane Collins had disappeared from Millbrook shortly after Bob's arrest, apparently concluding that a convicted felon facing financial ruin was not the exciting future she had envisioned. Mike Harrison had managed to save the insurance agency by cooperating fully with federal investigators and implementing new oversight procedures. But his friendship with Bob was permanently severed. As for me, I had discovered that life as a single woman in her late 60s was far more interesting than I had imagined. The Hartford Art Museum had offered me a part-time position in their education department, drawing on my decades of teaching, experience to develop programming for adult learners. Jennifer and David, once they recovered from the shock of their father's arrest, had rallied around me with fierce protectiveness and genuine admiration for the strength I had shown in impossible circumstances. "I'm proud of you, Mom," Jennifer had said during one of our weekly phone calls. "I know it couldn't have been easy, but you did the right thing." The right thing. For 40 years, I had defined the right thing as loyalty to my marriage, support for my husband, maintenance of our family unit regardless of personal cost. Now I understood that sometimes the right thing meant choosing justice over comfort, truth over convenience, self-respect over social approval. Bob had written me several letters from prison, each one asking for forgiveness, understanding, another chance to rebuild what we had lost. I had read them all but answered none, not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely had nothing left to say to the man who had been my husband. That conversation belonged to a different woman, one who had believed that love could overcome any betrayal, if you just tried hard enough. The woman I had become understood that some things, once broken, were meant to stay that way, and that the most courageous thing you could do was walk away from beautiful ruins and build something new from whatever remained of your authentic self. On the anniversary of what would have been our 41st wedding anniversary, I treated myself to dinner at the kind of expensive restaurant Bob and I had never visited because he preferred familiar places with reliable service. I ordered wine I had never tasted, tried cuisine I had never experienced, and made conversation with strangers who knew nothing about my history or my heartbreak. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt completely, authentically happy. The warm Sunday afternoon sun filtered through the lace curtains of our breakfast nook as I sat across from Bob, watching him methodically work through the crossword puzzle that had been his weekend ritual for as long as I could remember. His reading glasses perched low on his nose, silver hair catching the light. He looked every inch the distinguished gentleman that Millbrook society believed him to be. The irony of the scene wasn't lost on me that on this peaceful Sunday, less than 24 hours before his world would collapse entirely, Bob Thompson appeared more content and secure than he had in months. 7 letters. One who deceives, for personal gain, he read aloud, tapping his pen against the folded newspaper. Starts with S. I looked up from my own reading, a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt that I had been finding increasingly inspiring over the past few months. Swindler, I said without hesitation. Bob filled in the letters with satisfaction. Perfect. You always were better at these than me. He glanced over at my book with mild curiosity. Still reading about strong women, I see. I find their stories fascinating, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. Women who refused to accept the limitations others placed on them, who found ways to create meaningful lives despite overwhelming obstacles. Something in my tone must have registered because Bob looked at me more carefully, his pen suspended over the crossword. You've been reading a lot of that kind of thing lately. Biographies of women who overcame adversity. Is everything all right, Maggie? You seem different somehow. The question hung between us, loaded with possibilities. For a moment, I considered telling him everything, laying out the evidence I had gathered, confronting him with his betrayal. Here in our sunny breakfast nook where we had shared thousands of peaceful Sunday mornings. But that impulse belonged to the old Maggie, the woman who believed that honest communication could solve any problem, that love and commitment could overcome any obstacle. The new Maggie understood that some betrayals were too profound for explanation, some damage too extensive for repair. Bob had made his choices over 18 months of careful planning and systematic deception. Tomorrow he would learn the consequences of those choices. But today I would give him one final gift, the illusion that his plans were proceeding smoothly, that his wife remained the naive and trusting woman he believed her to be. I'm fine, I said, returning to my book. Just exploring different perspectives, I suppose. It's never too late to learn new things about yourself. Bob nodded absently and returned to his crossword, apparently satisfied with my explanation. The casual dismissal was so characteristic of him, so perfectly emblematic of the way he had always managed our relationship by accepting whatever surface explanation allowed him to avoid deeper engagement. For 40 years, I had accommodated this tendency, providing him with the emotional simplicity he preferred while handling the complex feelings and difficult conversations myself. But watching him now, seeing how easily he accepted my deflection while simultaneously betraying everything our marriage had supposedly meant to him, I felt the last remnants of my old accommodating nature finally die. Bob Thompson deserved exactly the level of consideration he had shown me over the past 18 months, which was to say, none whatsoever. The afternoon stretched ahead of us with the lazy quality of a Sunday in late autumn, when the changing seasons created a sense of suspended time before winter's arrival. Bob announced his intention to spend a few hours in his home office, reviewing client files and preparing for what he called some significant changes at the agency. I nodded supportively, playing the role of the understanding wife for perhaps the last time, while internally marveling at his ability to speak about destroying our marriage as if it were simply another business transition. I used his absence to walk through our house methodically, taking mental photographs of rooms that had contained 4 decades of shared life. The living room where we had celebrated the children's graduations, comforted each other through family, losses, and hosted countless gatherings of friends and neighbors. The kitchen where I had prepared thousands of meals, where we had lingered over coffee on weekend mornings, where Bob had proposed to me a second time on our 10th anniversary, joking that he wanted to make sure I still felt the same way about spending my life with him. Each room held its own collection of memories, its own evidence of the life we had built together before Bob decided that life was no longer sufficient for his needs. The family photos that lined the hallway chronicled our journey from young, newlyweds to established community members, from new parents to proud grandparents of Jennifer's 2 children. In every image, we looked happy, connected, committed to the shared enterprise of building something meaningful together. But looking at those photos now, I could see things I had missed at the time, subtle signs of the distance that had been growing between us long before Diane Collins entered the picture. The way Bob's smile had gradually become more performative, more calculated for the camera than genuine expression of joy. The increasing frequency with which his attention seemed to be elsewhere, even during family celebrations and milestone moments. The subtle but unmistakable shift from partnership to parallel lives, from collaboration to mere coexistence. Perhaps the seeds of our marriage's destruction had been planted years ago, nurtured by Bob's growing sense that he deserved more excitement, more appreciation, more validation than domestic life could provide. Perhaps Diane Collins had simply been the catalyst for a dissolution that had been inevitable once Bob decided that 40 years of commitment was a burden rather than a treasure. But regardless of when or how our marriage had begun to fail, Bob's response to that failure had revealed everything I needed to know about his character. Instead of honest conversation about his dissatisfaction, he had chosen deception. Instead of working to rebuild what we had lost, he had systematically planned its destruction. Instead of treating me as a partner deserving of respect and consideration, he had reduced me to an obstacle to be managed and ultimately discarded. Those choices had consequences, and tomorrow Bob would begin to understand what those consequences looked like. Evening arrived with the kind of golden light that made Connecticut's autumn landscape look like a painting, all amber and crimson against the deepening blue sky. Bob emerged from his office with the satisfied expression of a man who had accomplished important work, though I now knew that his work involved coordinating the final details of our divorce and his relocation to Florida with his secretary. "How about dinner at Romano's?" he suggested, referring to the Italian restaurant where we had celebrated numerous anniversaries and special occasions over the years. "I feel like marking the end of a perfect weekend." The suggestion was so perfectly typical of Bob's approach to life that I almost laughed. Even as he was preparing to abandon our marriage, he wanted to commemorate the moment with a romantic dinner at one of our traditional spots. It was as if he believed he could compartmentalize his betrayal, setting it aside long enough to enjoy one final evening of domestic comfort before discarding it entirely. "That sounds lovely," I replied, because it actually did sound lovely. And because I had discovered over the past few months that I could find genuine pleasure in moments of beauty, even while grieving the loss of everything I had believed about my life. Romano's was crowded with Sunday evening diners, families celebrating graduations and anniversaries, couples enjoying quiet meals together, groups of friends sharing bottles of wine and stories of their busy lives. The restaurant had been a fixture in Millbrook for 30 years, long enough to have served multiple generations of the same families, and Bob and I were greeted with the warmth reserved for longtime customers. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," exclaimed Maria Romano, the owner's daughter who had waited on us countless times over the years. "How wonderful to see you. Your usual table?" We were seated at a corner table with a view of the garden, the same spot we had requested for special occasions since the children were young. The familiar ritual of ordering wine, reviewing the menu, and settling into comfortable conversation felt both comforting and surreal, like participating in a play where I knew my lines perfectly, but understood that the story was about to take a dramatic turn the other actors couldn't anticipate. Bob ordered the osso buco he always chose at Romano's, while I selected the seafood risotto I had never tried before. Even in small ways, I was beginning to assert preferences that weren't filtered through decades of accommodation to Bob's tastes and expectations. The woman I was becoming had opinions about food, wine, music, and entertainment that didn't necessarily align with those of the man I had married. And discovering those preferences felt like archaeological work, uncovering artifacts of a self that had been buried under years of compromise and consideration for others. "This is nice," Bob said after our wine arrived, a Chianti he had selected with the confidence of someone who had developed expensive tastes over the years. "We should do this more often." The comment was so thoroughly characteristic of Bob's ability to speak about the future while actively planning to make that future impossible that I felt a moment of genuine amazement at his capacity for self-deception. Did he genuinely believe that we would be sharing romantic dinners at Romano's after he divorced me and moved to Florida with his secretary? Or was this simply another performance, another attempt to maintain the illusion of a happy marriage, for as long as it served his purposes? "We should," I agreed, raising my glass in a toast, "to new beginnings and unexpected discoveries." Bob touched his glass to mine with a smile that seemed genuinely warm, apparently interpreting my words as romantic sentiment rather than the farewell they actually represented. We drank to new beginnings, while only one of us understood what those beginnings would actually entail. The conversation over dinner flowed with the ease of 40 years of practice, touching on familiar topics like our children's careers, plans for the upcoming holidays, and local news from Millbrook's small but active social scene. Bob spoke enthusiastically about his upcoming retirement, describing it as an opportunity to pursue interests he had neglected during his years of building the business. He mentioned travel, golf, perhaps some consulting work to stay intellectually engaged. What he didn't mention was Diane Collins, the condo in Fort Lauderdale, or the divorce papers waiting in his office safe. His ability to compartmentalize was so complete that he seemed genuinely relaxed, genuinely present in our conversation, genuinely affectionate toward the wife he was planning to abandon within weeks. But I had learned to read the subtleties of Bob's behavior over 4 decades of marriage, and beneath his apparent contentment, I could detect signs of underlying tension. The way his hand moved unconsciously to his phone whenever it buzzed with a text message. The slight pause before he answered questions about his retirement timeline. The careful way he avoided mentioning any specific plans that would require my participation or input. Bob Thompson was a man living a double life, and the stress of maintaining that deception was beginning to show in small but unmistakable ways. "You know," he said as we shared a piece of tiramisu for dessert, "I've been thinking about our anniversary party last night. Seeing all those people who've been part of our lives for so many years, hearing their good wishes for our future together, it really made me appreciate what we've built." The words should have been touching, a romantic reflection on the milestone we had celebrated and the life we had created together. But coming from a man who had spent the previous 18 months systematically planning the destruction of that life, they felt like the cruelest mockery imaginable. "It was a beautiful evening," I replied, because it had been beautiful, despite everything I had known about its true significance. "I'm glad we decided to celebrate in style." 40 years, Bob mused, twirling his wine glass between his fingers. "It's hard to believe we've been together that long. Sometimes it feels like we just got married yesterday. And sometimes," I said quietly, "it feels like we've been strangers for much longer than we care to admit." The comment was more direct than anything I had said to Bob in months, and I saw his eyes sharpen slightly as he tried to parse the meaning behind my words. For a moment, he looked almost nervous, as if he was finally beginning to sense that his carefully maintained facade might not be as impenetrable as he had believed. "Strangers?" he repeated, his voice carefully neutral. "That's an interesting way to put it." I met his gaze steadily, allowing him to see just a hint of the steel that had been hardening inside me for months. "I just think it's possible to live with someone for 40 years and still discover you don't really know them at all. People change, Bob. Sometimes they become someone completely different from who you thought they were." The words hung between us like a challenge, and for several long seconds, Bob studied my face as if he was seeing me clearly for the first time in months. I could practically see the wheels turning in his mind, trying to determine whether my comment was general philosophical musing or something more specific and threatening. But Bob's fundamental narcissism saved him from recognizing the danger he was in. After a moment, his expression relaxed, and he reached across the table to cover my hand with his own. "Well," he said with the indulgent tone he might use with a child expressing abstract concerns. "I can honestly say that after 40 years, you're still the woman I married. Still kind, still thoughtful, still the person I fell in love with all those years ago." The patronizing dismissal was so perfectly characteristic of Bob's inability to take seriously any perspective that challenged his preferred narrative that I felt the last vestige of doubt about my chosen course of action finally evaporate. This was the man who had reduced 40 years of partnership to a series of pleasant but ultimately disposable memories, who saw me as a collection of agreeable qualities rather than a complete human being with thoughts, feelings, and agency of my own. Tomorrow, Bob Thompson would discover exactly how much he had underestimated the woman he thought he knew so well. We drove home through Millbrook's quiet streets, past houses where families were settling in for Sunday evening routines, where couples were sharing comfortable domestic moments that Bob and I had enjoyed thousands of times over the decades. The familiar landmarks of our shared life streets where we had walked with young children, parks where we had attended community events, the church where we had been married 40 years ago, all of it looked the same as always, but I experienced it with the detachment of someone who was already beginning to let go. Back in our house, Bob poured himself a scotch and settled into his recliner with the Sunday evening news, a ritual that had anchored our weekends for as long as I could remember. I joined him on the sofa, curling up with my Eleanor Roosevelt biography, and for a few minutes, we existed in the kind of comfortable domestic silence that had once been one of the great pleasures of our marriage. But now that silence felt hollow, a performance of intimacy that masked the complete absence of genuine connection between us. Bob was physically present but emotionally elsewhere, probably thinking about his Monday morning phone call to Diane Collins, his upcoming meetings with his divorce attorney, his plans for a future that deliberately excluded the woman sitting 3 feet away from him. "Early morning tomorrow," Bob said eventually, glancing at his watch. "I should probably get some sleep." I nodded, closing my book and following him upstairs to the bedroom we had shared for 35 years, since we had moved into this house when the children were young. The routine of preparing for bed together had once been intimate and comforting, a daily ritual of partnership that reinforced our connection to each other. Now, it felt like going through the motions of a relationship that had ended months ago, though only one of us had been informed of its termination. As Bob brushed his teeth and changed into his pajamas, I sat at my vanity removing the jewelry I had worn to dinner, each piece carrying its own history of gifts exchanged and occasions celebrated. The pearl earrings from our 20th anniversary, when we had renewed our vows in a small ceremony at St. Mary's Church. The gold bracelet Bob had given me when Jennifer was born, engraved with her name and birth date. The wedding ring that had encircled my finger for 40 years, through pregnancy and illness, triumph and disappointment, love and loss. Tomorrow, that ring would become evidence in divorce proceedings, its sentimental value reduced to whatever. Monetary worth could be determined by appraisers and attorneys. But tonight, It still carried the weight of 40 years of promises, even if those promises had turned out to be more fragile than I had ever imagined. "Maggie," Bob said as we settled into bed, his voice carrying an unusual note of uncertainty. "Are you happy? I mean, really happy with our life together?" The question caught me off guard, both because of its directness and because it suggested that Bob was finally beginning to sense the undercurrents he had been ignoring for months. Perhaps some part of him recognized that his wife had been changing, becoming someone less predictable and accommodating than the woman he had taken for granted for so many years. I turned to look at him in the dim light filtering through our bedroom curtains. This man who had been my partner, my lover, my closest companion for most of my adult life. Even now, knowing everything I knew about his betrayal and his plans for our future, I felt a flicker of the old affection, a recognition of the person he had been before ambition and entitlement had corrupted his capacity for genuine love. "I'm discovering what happiness means," I replied carefully. "I think I confused it with security for a long time, with the comfort of familiar routines and expectations. But real happiness requires honesty, Bob. With yourself, and with the people you love." Bob studied my face in the darkness, and I wondered if he could see the fundamental change that had taken place inside me over the past months. The transformation, from willing accommodator to woman with her own agenda and her own sense of justice. "Sometimes I think you're too philosophical for your own good," he said finally, the comment carrying just enough affection to soften what might otherwise have been criticism. "Some things are simpler than you make them out to be." "And sometimes," I replied, "things that seem simple are actually much more complicated than we want to admit." Bob reached for my hand under the covers, his fingers intertwining with mine in a gesture that had once provided comfort and connection, but now felt like a performance of intimacy rather than its genuine expression. "Whatever happens," he said, quietly, "I want you to know that these 40 years have been the best of my life." The words should have been beautiful, a romantic declaration from a husband to his wife on the eve of their 41st anniversary year, but spoken by a man who had spent 18 months systematically planning to abandon that wife. They felt like the final insult, the last attempt to manipulate my emotions while providing himself with the comfort of believing he had been a good husband until the very end. "Thank you," I said, because any other response would have required more honesty than either of us was prepared for. We lay in the darkness listening to each other breathe, two people who had shared a bed for 40 years, but who were now complete strangers to each other, each harboring secrets that would fundamentally alter the other's understanding of reality. Bob believed he was spending his last night as a married man before beginning the process of claiming his freedom. I knew he was spending his last night as a free man before beginning to face the consequences of choices that would define the remainder of his life. Sometime around midnight, Bob's breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep, and I allowed myself to really look at him one final time. In sleep, he looked older than his 69 years, the stress of maintaining his double life evident, in the lines around his eyes and the tension in his jaw, even in unconsciousness. But he also looked peaceful, unburdened by guilt or conscience, secure in his belief that he had successfully managed every aspect of his deception. By tomorrow evening, Bob Thompson's life as he had known it would be over. His reputation would be in ruins, his business destroyed, his carefully planned future with Diane Collins revealed as the fantasy it had always been. The federal charges alone would likely result in prison time, and the civil lawsuits from defrauded clients would consume whatever assets remained after the divorce settlement. But lying there in our bed for the last time, I felt no satisfaction in anticipating his downfall, no joy in contemplating his suffering. What I felt was a profound sadness for the waste of it all, for the beautiful life we had built together, that Bob had chosen to destroy rather than work to renew, for the love that had been real once, but had been corrupted by his need for validation, and his willingness to treat other people as expendable resources in his pursuit of what he imagined. would make him happy. Dawn was beginning to lighten the sky outside our bedroom windows when I finally fell asleep, and my last conscious thought was a prayer not for Bob's punishment, but for his eventual understanding of what he had lost and what it had cost him to lose it. The alarm clock's shrill cry pierced the Monday morning silence at exactly 6:30, the same time it had awakened Bob Thompson for the past 20 years of his professional life. I watched from my side of the bed as he stirred, stretched, and reached automatically for his phone to check the messages that had accumulated overnight. His face was illuminated by the blue glow of the screen, and I could see his expression shift from sleepy contentment to focused attention as he scrolled through what I knew would be communications from Diane Collins, his divorce attorney, and various contacts involved in his elaborate deception. This was the morning Bob had been planning for 18 months, the beginning of what he believed would be his triumphant transition from dutiful husband to liberated man. In his carefully constructed timeline, today would mark the start of his final week as a married man, with divorce papers to be filed on Friday, and his resignation from Thompson & Harrison Insurance, effective the following Monday. He had orchestrated every detail with the same meticulous attention he brought to complex business deals, never considering that the woman lying beside him might have plans of her own. "Important messages?" I asked, my voice carrying the drowsy curiosity of a wife who had no reason to suspect her husband of anything more complicated than early morning business correspondence. Bob glanced over at me with a smile that seemed genuinely affectionate, the expression of a man who believed he was successfully managing every aspect of his life. Just some follow-up from the weekend meetings. Nothing urgent. The lie came so easily that I wondered how many times over the past 18 months he had practiced this kind of casual deception. How natural it had become for him to look directly into my eyes and speak words that bore no relationship to reality. I nodded and settled back into my pillow, playing the role of the trusting wife for what I knew would be the final time. Bob rose from bed with the energy of a man who felt in complete control of his destiny, moving through his morning routine with the efficient purposefulness that had characterized his approach to everything throughout our marriage. Shower, shave, dress in one of the expensive suits that projected success and respectability, breakfast of coffee and toast consumed while reviewing the day's schedule. But this morning, I noticed details that had escaped my attention during the months when I was still trying to preserve our marriage rather than document its destruction. The way Bob checked his reflection in the hall mirror with particular care, adjusting his tie and smoothing his silver hair as if preparing for an important performance. The almost imperceptible spring in his step as he gathered his briefcase and car keys, the subtle signs of a man who was excited about something he couldn't share with his wife. "I'll probably be late tonight," he said, pausing in the kitchen doorway to deliver the kind of routine update that had punctuated thousands of ordinary mornings. "Mike and I need to go over some transition details, and you know how those conversations can drag on." The casual mention of transition details sent a chill through me, because I now understood exactly what kind of transition Bob was planning. Not a simple business succession, but the complete dismantling of our shared life, executed with the same strategic thinking he brought to major corporate restructuring. In Bob's mind, I was simply another asset to be managed and ultimately divested, a complication to be resolved as efficiently as possible. "Of course," I replied, maintaining the understanding tone that had characterized my responses to Bob's explanations for 40 years. "Take your time. I'll probably have dinner with Carol anyway." Bob nodded absently, his attention already shifting to whatever challenges awaited him at the office. As he leaned down to kiss my cheek in the perfunctory goodbye that had become our standard farewell, I caught a whiff of the expensive cologne that had become his signature scent over the past 2 years. I wondered if Diane Collins had helped him select it, if she had been influencing his choices in ways both large and small, while I remained oblivious to her existence. "See you tonight, sweetheart," he said, and there was something almost wistful in his voice, as if some part of him recognized that this casual domestic exchange represented the end of an era, the final moment when he could maintain the illusion that he was still the devoted husband rather than the calculating stranger he had become. I listened to his car pull out of our driveway and disappear down Elm Street, carrying Bob toward what he believed would be just another day of careful planning and strategic maneuvering. In reality, he was driving toward a reckoning that would strip away every comfortable illusion he had constructed about his life, his character, and his future. By 9 o'clock that morning, I was sitting in Janet Morrison's Hartford office, reviewing the final details of the legal avalanche that was about to bury Bob's carefully constructed plans. Janet had coordinated with federal investigators, divorce, court officials, and asset protection specialists to ensure that every aspect of Bob's deception would be exposed simultaneously, giving him no opportunity to implement damage control or protect any of the resources he had been systematically hiding. The federal agents will arrest him at his office at 11:30, Janet explained, consulting the detailed timeline we had developed over weeks of preparation. The arrest warrant includes charges of wire fraud, bank fraud, and elder abuse related to his manipulation of client accounts. Simultaneously, divorce papers will be filed here in Hartford, along with emergency motions to freeze all marital assets pending investigation. I nodded, feeling remarkably calm despite the magnitude of what was about to unfold. For months, I had lived with the anxiety of maintaining my facade while gathering evidence of Bob's betrayal. Now that the moment of revelation had finally arrived, I felt only a profound sense of relief that the performance was ending, and truth was finally being allowed to emerge. "What about Diane Collins?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "She'll be questioned as a potential accomplice, but unless she was directly involved in the financial crimes, she's unlikely to face charges. However, her career as Bob's secretary is obviously over, and I suspect she'll discover that her romantic future with a convicted felon is considerably less appealing than she imagined." The phone rang at exactly 11:45, and Janet answered with the crisp professionalism that had made her one of Connecticut's most successful divorce attorneys. "Robert Thompson is in federal custody," she announced after ending the call. "The arrest went smoothly, and all assets have been frozen effective immediately. The media has been notified, and I expect coverage will begin with the noon news cycle." I closed my eyes and felt 40 years of marriage officially end with those simple words. Bob was no longer my problem to solve, my burden to carry, my betrayal to endure. He was now facing the consequences of choices that would define the remainder of his life, while I was finally free to discover who Margaret Sullivan could become after 4 decades of being Mrs. Robert Thompson. The drive back to Millbrook felt like traveling through a transformed landscape, even though nothing had changed except my legal status and Bob's freedom. Carol followed me in her own car, providing both moral support and practical assistance, as I prepared to face the inevitable media attention and community reaction that would follow news of Bob's arrest. By the time we reached Elm Street, news vans were already stationed outside our house, and reporters were conducting interviews with neighbors who expressed shock and disbelief that the respected businessman they had known for decades could be capable of federal crimes. I parked in our garage and entered through the kitchen, avoiding the cameras and microphones that would transform our private tragedy into public entertainment. Inside our house, everything looked exactly as it had when Bob left that morning, but the familiar rooms felt like museum exhibits from a vanished civilization. The coffee cup he had left on the kitchen counter, the newspaper folded to the business section where he had been reading about market trends, the reading glasses he had forgotten on his bedside table, all of these ordinary objects now carried the weight of evidence from a life that had ended as abruptly as if Bob had died rather than simply been arrested. My phone buzzed constantly with calls from friends, neighbors, former colleagues, and reporters seeking comment on the stunning reversal of fortune that had transformed Millbrook's most respected couple into a federal crime story. I ignored them, all, not yet ready to engage with the explanations and justifications that would consume the coming weeks. Instead, I sat in our living room with Carol, drinking tea and processing the reality that the most significant chapter of my life had just concluded with handcuffs and criminal charges, rather than the gradual transition into retirement that Bob and I had once imagined. "How are you feeling?" Carol asked, studying my face with the concern of a sister who had watched me navigate this ordeal with remarkable strength and determination. "Free," I replied, and realized it was true. For the first time in 18 months, I wasn't wondering what Bob was really doing when he claimed to be working late, wasn't worrying about financial security while he systematically emptied our accounts, wasn't lying awake at night trying to understand how the man I had loved for 40 years had become someone I didn't recognize. The 6 o'clock news led with Bob's arrest, complete with footage of him being escorted from the Thompson and Harrison Insurance building in handcuffs, his face a mask of shock and disbelief that suggested he had never seriously considered the possibility that his crimes would be discovered and prosecuted. The reporters described him as a pillar of the Millbrook community, whose double life had been exposed through an investigation triggered by evidence provided by an unnamed source with intimate knowledge of his business practices. That unnamed source sat in her living room, watching her husband's public humiliation with a mixture of sadness for what had been lost and satisfaction that justice was finally being served. The woman who had spent 6 months systematically building the case that brought down Robert Thompson's criminal enterprise would remain anonymous, but I would carry that knowledge like a secret source of strength for the rest of my life. The MI. Phone rang during the news broadcast, and I was surprised to see Jennifer's name on the caller ID. My daughter was calling from Seattle, where she had undoubtedly seen the national coverage of her father's arrest. "Mom," she said, her voice tight with emotion, "I just saw the news. Are you okay? What can David and I do to help?" The concern in her voice brought tears to my eyes, both because of the love it represented and because it forced me to confront the reality that Bob's choices had devastated our children as well as our marriage. Jennifer and David would now have to navigate the complicated emotions of loving a father who had turned out to be capable of criminal behavior, of processing their own shock and disappointment while supporting their mother through the aftermath of betrayal. "I'm okay," I told her, meaning it more than she could possibly understand. "Actually, I'm better than I've been in months. Your father made choices that led to this outcome, and now he has to face the consequences of those choices." "Did you know?" Jennifer asked quietly. "About what he was doing?" The question hung between us, loaded with implications about complicity, loyalty, and the complicated moral landscape that families navigate when someone they love commits crimes. I chose my words carefully, conscious that my daughter needed to understand both the truth of what had happened and her mother's role in ensuring that truth came to light. "I suspected something was wrong for months," I replied. "When I discovered the extent of your father's deception, I did what I believed was right. I couldn't allow him to continue stealing from vulnerable people, and I couldn't allow him to destroy our family's financial security while pretending to be a devoted husband." Jennifer was quiet for several long moments, processing the revelation that her mother had been actively investigating her father's crimes rather than simply falling victim to them. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of admiration that surprised me. "I'm proud of you, Mom. I know it couldn't have been easy, but you did the right thing." The right thing. For 40 years, I had defined the right thing as loyalty to my marriage, support for my husband, maintenance of our family unit regardless of personal cost. Now I understood that sometimes the right thing meant choosing justice over comfort, truth over convenience, self-respect over social approval. 3 weeks later, I stood in the bedroom of my new apartment in downtown Hartford, unpacking boxes that contained the carefully selected possessions I had chosen to take from the house on Elm Street. The divorce proceedings were moving forward, with remarkable speed, assisted by Bob's desire to negotiate a settlement from prison rather than face additional media scrutiny through a prolonged court battle. Bob's guilty plea to federal charges had resulted in an 18-month prison sentence, and complete forfeiture of the assets he had stolen from client accounts. The remaining marital property would be divided according to Connecticut's equitable distribution laws, with the court showing particular consideration for my status as the innocent spouse who had been systematically defrauded by her husband. Mike Harrison had managed to save Thompson and Harrison Insurance by cooperating fully with federal investigators and implementing comprehensive oversight procedures, but his partnership with Bob was permanently severed, and the agency's reputation would require years to fully recover. As for Diane Collins, she had disappeared from Millbrook within days of Bob's arrest, apparently concluding that a convicted felon facing financial ruin was not the exciting future she had envisioned. The young woman who had believed herself to be part of a romantic adventure had discovered the difference between fantasy and reality when federal agents questioned her about her knowledge of Bob's criminal activities. The Hartford Art Museum had offered me a position in their education department, drawing on my decades of teaching experience to develop programming for adult learners. The work was intellectually stimulating and emotionally fulfilling in ways that surprised me, providing opportunities to engage with art, literature, and ideas that had been pushed aside during my years of focusing primarily on domestic responsibilities. Jennifer and David visited frequently, their initial shock at their father's crimes gradually giving way to a deeper appreciation for their mother's strength and courage in exposing his betrayal. They had been forced to revise their understanding of both parents, recognizing that the woman they had sometimes taken for granted possessed reserves of intelligence and determination they had never fully appreciated. "You seem different, Mom," David observed during one of his visits. "Stronger somehow. More yourself, if that makes sense." It made perfect sense, because I was more myself than I had been in decades. The woman who had accommodated Bob's preferences and managed his emotional needs while suppressing her own authentic responses had been replaced by someone who understood that love without respect was worthless, that loyalty without reciprocity was exploitation, that marriage without honesty was simply an elaborate performance. On a cold December morning, exactly 6 months after Bob's arrest, I received a letter from him at the Federal Correctional Facility where he was serving his sentence. The envelope was addressed in his familiar handwriting, and for several minutes, I held it without opening it, wondering what Bob Thompson could possibly have to say to the woman whose life he had attempted to destroy. The letter was shorter than I had expected, written in the careful script Bob had always used for important documents. He apologized for his betrayal, acknowledged the pain he had caused our family, and expressed regret for the choices that had led to his imprisonment. But the letter also contained requests for forgiveness, for understanding, for some indication that the woman he had tried to discard might be willing to help him rebuild his life when his sentence was completed. I read the letter twice, then placed it in the drawer with other documents related to our divorce proceedings. Bob's words carried no emotional weight for me, no power to reopen wounds that had healed or revive feelings that had died. The man who had written that letter was a stranger who happened to share a history with me, someone whose choices had revealed a character I had never truly known despite 40 years of marriage. I wrote no reply, because I had nothing left to say to Robert Thompson. Our conversation had ended the morning he left our house for the final time, whistling an old tune and believing he was driving toward freedom rather than the destruction of everything he had spent his life building. Instead, I spent that December evening reading in my new apartment, surrounded by books I had chosen without considering anyone else's preferences, drinking wine I had selected because I enjoyed its taste, rather than because it complimented someone else's dinner choice, planning a future that belonged entirely to me. The woman who had been Mrs. Robert Thompson for 40 years was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the most courageous thing you could do was walk away from a beautiful lie and choose an uncertain but honest truth. Margaret Sullivan was 67 years old, financially secure, intellectually engaged, and emotionally free for the first time since she was 27. And she was finally, completely, authentically happy. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.